Some stories begin with a man chasing a dream. Others begin with a man trying to escape one. On a quiet river far from the battlefields that shaped him, Rambo has built a life around distance. The water moves forward while his memories remain behind. Yet a life built on isolation can survive only until someone asks you to return to the world you escaped. The story begins with that contradiction, a man who has become exceptionally good at surviving and who now has to decide whether survival is enough. This is not simply the return of a famous action character. It is a commercial experiment built around an aging cultural asset. The character already carried decades of recognition, while Sylvester Stallone's identity was closely connected to him. That recognition reduced one kind of risk, because audiences already knew the name and the promise. But it created another kind. Viewers remember younger versions of iconic characters, and a studio has to prove that an older version still deserves a place in the marketplace. The reported production budget was approximately $47.5 to $50 million. That was substantial capital, but modest compared with many contemporary action blockbusters. The production still needed jungle locations, weapons, explosions, stunt performers, vehicles, practical effects, international crews, and extensive post-production. The central financial challenge was therefore capital efficiency. How could the filmmakers create a large physical experience without spending at blockbuster scale? The answer began with the franchise itself. Previous films had already paid the cost of introducing the character, establishing his personality, and building audience recognition. The new production could spend its resources on reactivation rather than introduction. But a legacy character also carries expectation risk. Audiences remember what Rambo used to be. The film therefore had to acknowledge time rather than pretend it had stopped. Rambo is older, isolated, and reluctant to return to violence, and that reluctance becomes the emotional foundation of the story. Psychologically, his isolation is more than retirement. It is a form of risk management. Rambo knows what violence does to him, and he has spent years reducing his exposure to situations that could reactivate that identity. The humanitarian workers who approach him challenge this equilibrium. They believe their moral purpose justifies entering a dangerous region. Rambo understands that good intentions do not automatically create safety. His refusal comes from experience. He knows what happens when compassion enters an environment governed by organized violence. The setting gives that personal conflict real historical weight. The story takes place against the background of the conflict in Burma, now commonly called Myanmar, where the Karen population had experienced decades of warfare, displacement, military abuses, forced labor, and landmine use. Those realities were not invented for the movie. At the same time, the individual characters and rescue mission are fictionalized. The film is therefore a dramatization built on a real historical environment, not a documentary reconstruction of the conflict. That distinction matters because real history is far more complicated than a 91-minute action film can explain. Political movements, ethnic groups, military structures, humanitarian organizations, and decades of grievances cannot all receive equal attention. The screenplay instead creates a direct moral framework that the audience can understand quickly. Civilians are vulnerable, humanitarian workers are trying to help, violence threatens them, and Rambo possesses skills that could change the outcome. The simplification serves narrative efficiency, even while limiting historical complexity. The geography is also a major production asset. Rivers, jungle, mountains, villages, caves, mud, and tropical weather provide visual complexity that would be extremely expensive to manufacture digitally. A real environment already contains texture, depth, movement, atmosphere, and unpredictable detail. But authenticity has a cost. Equipment must be transported, large crews must move through difficult terrain, weather can interrupt schedules, and safety becomes a constant concern. The jungle therefore functions as both creative capital and logistical risk. The technology follows the same philosophy. The film was photographed on 35mm film using professional Aeroflex and Aerocam cameras, with Zeiss and Angenia's lenses, before entering a digital intermediate workflow. This hybrid approach combines the texture of photochemical capture with the flexibility of digital finishing. Practical explosions, physical stunts, weapons, vehicles, makeup effects, and real locations provide the foundation, while digital work can refine and extend what was photographed. Technology is valuable here not because it is new, but because it serves the intended experience. The film also makes its audience promise unusually clear. Its R rating and extreme violence identify it as adult action rather than a broad family adventure. That narrows the potential market, but it strengthens product clarity. The marketing can tell viewers exactly what they are buying. The return of a familiar warrior, presented with modern intensity and very little restraint. Stallone's face and the Rambo name then provide immediate recognition, reducing the amount of advertising space required simply to explain the product. The commercial results suggest that the strategy had meaningful viability. The film earned approximately $113.2 million worldwide against a production budget of roughly $47.5 to $50 million. That is not the same as profit because theaters retain part of ticket revenue and marketing, distribution, financing, and other costs must also be recovered. But it demonstrates that the franchise still possessed significant international demand. The character remained a valuable global asset rather than merely a nostalgic memory. Beneath the business calculation is the question that makes the product useful. What happens when the ability that made you valuable is also the ability you most want to escape? Rambo is capable of surviving violence, but he does not want violence to remain the center of his identity. When the people he was asked to help are captured, inaction becomes another risk. The first half of a film is an investment in a promise. Before an audience receives the major payoff, the story has to convince us that the journey is worth our time. Here, the setup works by presenting a man who has deliberately reduced his life to something simple: work, water, distance, and routine. That simplicity is important because it establishes the baseline from which everything else will change. We understand that he is not searching for adventure. He is actively avoiding it. The arrival of the humanitarian group functions like an unexpected business proposal. They need transportation through a dangerous region, and they believe their mission is morally important enough to justify the risk. Rambo sees the same proposal through a completely different lens. He sees exposure, uncertainty, and the possibility that violence will return to his life. Their disagreement is not merely dialogue. It is the collision between idealism and experience. From a storytelling perspective, this is efficient setup. The film does not need a long explanation of Rambo's entire history before giving him a decision. His behavior tells us enough. He is competent, reserved, and uncomfortable discussing the past. His environment reinforces those qualities. The river is open, but his emotional world is closed. That contrast gives the opening scenes a quiet tension. We know that the story cannot remain peaceful forever, and we begin watching for the event that will break the routine. This is similar to startup R&D. Before a company launches a finished product, it tests a prototype. A story does something similar during its opening act. It introduces the central character, establishes the marketable promise, identifies the problem, and tests whether the audience is willing to continue. The first half is therefore not wasted time before the action. It is the research phase that makes the action valuable. The humanitarian mission becomes the film's first major prototype. The audience sees the group enter an environment they do not fully understand. Their intentions are sincere, but sincerity does not protect them from geography, politics, or violence. Rambo understands this immediately. That difference gives the story its central tension. The audience can respect the missionaries' courage while also understanding why Rambo considers their plan dangerously naive. The pacing is deliberately measured because the later violence needs contrast. If the film began with non-stop combat, the audience would quickly adapt to the intensity. By allowing quieter scenes first, the production creates an emotional baseline. Silence becomes meaningful. Water becomes meaningful. Rambo's routine becomes meaningful. When those things are interrupted, the audience experiences the change rather than simply observing it. That is a form of pacing ROI. Every quiet minute must eventually produce value. It has to establish character, geography, emotional stakes, or anticipation. In this case, the slower opening gives us information that the later action depends upon. We understand that Rambo knows the river. We understand that he recognizes danger. We understand that he wants distance from violence. Therefore, when circumstances eventually force him toward conflict, the decision carries more weight. The film also makes an important psychological investment in Rambo's reluctance. An action hero who eagerly searches for combat can become predictable. A reluctant warrior creates suspense because the audience understands that his abilities exist, but his willingness to use them is uncertain. This turns character psychology into a narrative engine. We are not asking whether Rambo can fight. We are asking what will make him decide that fighting is necessary. The humanitarian characters provide another layer of emotional investment. Their presence gives the conflict a human purpose beyond Rambo's personal history. They believe they can help people. That motivation creates moral stakes, but it also exposes the limits of good intentions. The film wants the audience to respect compassion while understanding that compassion without preparation can become dangerous. This is where the screenplay begins building what could be called emotional product-market fit. The audience needs to care about the people who will eventually require rescue. If they do not, the later action becomes spectacle without consequence. By establishing the missionaries as vulnerable outsiders entering a dangerous environment, the film creates a simple emotional equation. They have crossed into a world they cannot control, and the one person capable of understanding that world has chosen to remain outside it. The first half also benefits from geographical clarity. Rivers, villages, jungle paths, and remote communities establish the physical problem that the characters will eventually have to solve. Distance matters. Isolation matters. Transportation matters. Once the group travels farther from safety, every subsequent decision becomes more expensive. In production terms, geography creates stakes without requiring constant dialogue. The film's restrained opening also gives Stallone room to play age and exhaustion rather than simply physical strength. The character is no longer introduced as an unstoppable machine. His body carries history. His silence carries history. His reluctance carries history. This changes the audience's relationship with him. We are not simply waiting to see what the hero can do. We are watching to see whether he will allow himself to become that person again. The economic logic becomes clearer when we consider what the production is saving during these scenes. Quiet conversations, real landscapes, controlled movement, and character-driven sequences generally require fewer resources than the climactic battles. The production can therefore spend relatively modestly while building the emotional foundation required for its most expensive material. Effective filmmaking often concentrates capital where the audience's attention is most valuable. Eventually, the disappearance of the humanitarian group changes the investment equation. Rambo's earlier refusal has consequences. The choice to stay out of the conflict is no longer neutral because people he knows are now in danger. The film converts his previous decision into a source of pressure. This is strong narrative economics. Information established early becomes valuable later. The first half therefore functions like a carefully managed investment portfolio. Character development is the long-term asset. Geography provides production value. Dialogue establishes the moral problem. Rambo's reluctance creates psychological tension. The humanitarian mission creates emotional stakes. The slow accumulation of these elements prepares the audience for a much larger return in the second half. By the end of the first half, the audience has been given a clear proposition. A man who has spent years avoiding his past is being pulled directly toward it. The people he tried to keep at a distance are now part of his life again. The peaceful environment he constructed can no longer remain separate from the violence beyond it. The story has completed its prototype phase, preparing the audience for the moment when restraint gives way to action. The second half is where the film has to collect the emotional and narrative investment created during the opening. A setup can be atmospheric, psychologically interesting, and historically grounded, but none of those qualities matter commercially if the eventual payoff feels disconnected from what came before. Here, the disappearance of the humanitarian group changes the story from a question of whether Rambo will intervene into a question of what his intervention will cost. The movie has established his reluctance, so his return to violence becomes the payoff to the central psychological promise. This is where the story begins behaving like a product moving from prototype to launch. During the first half, the audience was given reasons to care. Now those reasons have to produce results. The missing missionaries provide an immediate objective. The mercenaries provide specialized capability. Rambo provides local knowledge and extraordinary combat experience. The conflict therefore becomes a system in which different forms of competence have to combine. From a storytelling perspective, this is efficient because every major character now has a function inside the rescue operation. The payoff also benefits from escalation. The first half established danger largely through anticipation and environment. The second half converts that potential into physical consequences. The jungle is no longer simply a remote landscape. It becomes a battlefield. Villages, roads, compounds, rivers, mud, smoke, weapons, and bodies all become parts of the same operational environment. The audience has already learned that the terrain is difficult, so when the rescue team moves deeper into it, the geography itself contributes to suspense. This is a form of emotional product-market fit. The audience that came to see Rambo expects action, but action alone is not enough. The action must feel like the logical expression of the character and the circumstances. Rambo does not suddenly become violent because the film needs an explosion. He becomes violent because the situation has crossed the boundary he was trying to protect. That connection between motivation and spectacle is what gives the later sequences their emotional value. The mercenary team is particularly useful here because it provides a contrast with Rambo. These men understand violence as a profession. They are practical, experienced, and prepared for danger. Rambo is different. He understands violence even more deeply, but his relationship with it is personal. That distinction gives the rescue operation two competing philosophies. The mercenaries ask how the mission can be completed. Rambo increasingly confronts the deeper question of why he is willing to enter the fight at all. Once the group reaches the conflict zone, the movie can release the visual and physical resources that were being conserved earlier. Multiple cameras, stunt performers, practical effects, weapons, vehicles, explosions, smoke, blood, and sound design all become more prominent. This is where the production's capital allocation becomes visible. The quieter first half created emotional demand at relatively low physical cost. The second half spends that accumulated audience attention on spectacle. The climactic violence is intentionally excessive, but that excess has a structural purpose. The film wants the audience to experience the war as overwhelming rather than elegant. Gunfire arrives from multiple directions. Bodies move through smoke and mud. Explosions disrupt the geography. The camera captures physical consequences rather than allowing violence to remain abstract. This approach is divisive, but it is consistent with the product the film promised, a brutally physical action experience. The most important payoff, however, is not the body count. It is Rambo's transformation from reluctant observer to active participant. Earlier, he believed that staying away from violence was the only way to control his life. Now he discovers that refusing to act can also carry a moral cost. His decision to fight is therefore not simply a return to his old identity. It is a recognition that his abilities can be used according to his own judgment. That distinction gives the climax psychological meaning. Rambo is not fighting because he loves war. He is fighting because he has decided that there are circumstances in which refusing to fight would violate his own values. The warrior identity that once seemed like a curse becomes, temporarily, an instrument of agency. He does not erase his past. He decides how to use what the past has made him. The final battle also demonstrates the principle of spectacle concentration. A production does not need every scene to look expensive. It needs the moments that matter most to feel expensive. The film saves much of its largest physical expenditure for the climax, where the audience has already been emotionally prepared to care about the outcome. This is essentially ROI in storytelling. A dollar spent on a major action sequence has greater perceived value when the audience has already invested emotionally in the characters involved. The editing and sound then multiply that investment. Rapid cuts can create urgency, while wider shots preserve enough geography for the audience to understand scale. Gunfire, explosions, impacts, and music create an acoustic wall of violence. The combination of image and sound makes the battle feel larger than the individual pieces that created it. The viewer is not consciously calculating how many cameras or effects were used. The viewer simply experiences intensity. The rescue itself provides the most direct narrative payoff. The people introduced earlier as idealistic outsiders have become the reason Rambo must confront the world he rejected. Their vulnerability turns his earlier warnings into consequences. The film therefore closes a structural loop. He told them the environment was dangerous. They entered it anyway, they were captured, and he ultimately has to enter that same environment to bring them back. The story's central conflict has moved from warning to action. That is why the commercial and emotional payoff ultimately intersect. The audience came for the recognizable warrior, and the film gives them the warrior. But it also gives that warrior a reason to exist beyond nostalgia. The character has aged, the world has changed, and the violence has become more extreme, yet the underlying question remains human. Can someone shaped by violence still choose a different direction? The second half therefore succeeds when it remembers that spectacle is the delivery mechanism, not the entire product. The explosions create attention. The action creates excitement. The weapons create physical credibility. But the psychological journey creates meaning. Without the earlier investment, the climax would simply be a sequence of destruction. Because the film established Rambo's reluctance, the violence becomes the external expression of an internal decision. A character can be understood by watching what he does, but a character can be understood much more deeply by examining what he refuses to do. Rambo spends much of the story refusing to return to the identity that made him famous. His behavior is therefore a study in trauma, avoidance, moral responsibility, and the psychology of a person who has learned that his greatest strength is also connected to his greatest pain. His life on the river represents controlled isolation. He has reduced his world to practical routines and limited relationships, creating an environment in which he does not have to make difficult moral choices. This resembles avoidance conditioning. When an experience is associated with pain, people often learn to avoid situations that might reproduce it. For Rambo, organized violence is connected to years of war, loss, and psychological damage. Staying away from conflict therefore gives him something valuable: predictability. The missionaries challenge that predictability. Their motives are compassionate, but Rambo immediately recognizes the mismatch between intention and capability. They want to help vulnerable people, yet they are entering a region where they cannot control the environment or the armed groups around them. His warning is therefore partly practical and partly psychological. He is telling them what he knows from experience, but he is also protecting himself from becoming involved again. That creates the first major behavioral economic conflict. Rambo is weighing two different forms of loss. Helping the missionaries could cost him his emotional stability and force him back into violence. Refusing could leave innocent people exposed to danger. His initial decision favors personal risk avoidance. It is rational from the perspective of protecting himself, but it becomes increasingly difficult to defend once the consequences become visible. This is where moral responsibility enters the character. Rambo does not begin the story as a traditional hero looking for an opportunity to save people. In fact, he appears almost determined not to be one. That makes his eventual intervention more meaningful. Heroism is not presented as an automatic personality trait. It emerges from a decision. He has to decide whether his responsibility to other people outweighs his responsibility to protect himself from his own past. The missionaries themselves represent a contrasting psychological model. They believe that moral purpose can justify risk. Their optimism is sincere, but the film deliberately places that optimism against Rambo's experience. Neither side is completely irrational. They understand something he has temporarily forgotten. People sometimes have to enter dangerous situations because remaining outside them allows suffering to continue. Rambo understands something they underestimate. Good intentions do not cancel the realities of violence. This disagreement gives the story a useful leadership dynamic. The missionaries possess moral conviction but limited tactical knowledge. Rambo possesses extraordinary tactical knowledge but has almost no desire to lead. Their interaction, therefore, creates a problem of complementary competence. One side knows why the mission matters. The other understands what the environment can do to unprepared people. The eventual rescue effort works because those different forms of knowledge become connected. Rambo's trauma also affects how he communicates. He is not a character who explains his feelings easily. His silence is part of his defense system. Rather than describing everything he has experienced, he keeps emotional distance between himself and other people. That makes his rare moments of directness more important. When he speaks with certainty about violence, the audience understands that his confidence comes from experience rather than theory. Leadership pressure becomes especially interesting once the rescue mission begins. Rambo is not simply the strongest person in the group. He becomes the person whose decisions can determine whether others live or die. That creates a responsibility he cannot escape. Once people depend on his knowledge, remaining emotionally detached becomes almost impossible. Competence creates obligation. The better he is at surviving, the harder it becomes to justify refusing to use that ability when others need it. The mercenaries provide another psychological contrast. They are comfortable with violence in a way Rambo is not. For them, combat is a profession with objectives, risks, and payment. Rambo's relationship with combat is existential. He does not simply perform violence. Violence is connected to his identity. This difference makes him more psychologically complicated than the people around him, even when they possess similar physical skills. The film also explores the psychology of desensitization. Characters who operate in violent environments can become accustomed to danger, but the movie does not treat this as emotional invulnerability. Rambo's apparent calm can be interpreted as the result of long exposure rather than the absence of feeling. He understands what violence means precisely because he has experienced so much of it. His restraint is therefore not evidence that he is unaffected. It can be evidence that he is deeply affected. The conflict forces another behavioral shift. Observation becomes participation. At first, Rambo watches the situation from a distance. He understands what is happening, but tries not to become part of it. Once the people he knows are threatened, that distance becomes psychologically unsustainable. This is an important turning point because his behavior changes before the full action begins. The decision to intervene is the true climax of his internal conflict. His eventual violence can therefore be interpreted through the concept of moral injury. A person can suffer psychologically not only because of what was done to them, but because of what they believe they should have done and failed to do. Rambo's earlier decision to stay out of the conflict creates exactly this possibility. If he remains passive while innocent people suffer, he risks becoming responsible in his own mind for an outcome he might have prevented. The film does not make that psychological calculation explicit in academic language. It communicates it through behavior. Rambo listens. He observes. He hesitates. He becomes increasingly involved. Then he acts. This is important because the story is designed for visual storytelling rather than psychological exposition. The audience is expected to interpret his internal state from his choices. The title character also represents a broader leadership archetype, the reluctant specialist. In business, military organizations, and emergency response, highly capable individuals are not always the people who want authority. Sometimes responsibility arrives because circumstances reveal that they possess knowledge nobody else has. Rambo fits that pattern. He does not seek command, but his experience makes him indispensable once the situation becomes dangerous. The business of filmmaking becomes especially visible when we examine the money behind a movie. An action film may look like a simple sequence of explosions, performances, and locations, but underneath the finished image is a financial structure designed to turn investment into audience demand. For Rambo, that structure depended on a recognizable franchise, an experienced star, controlled production spending, international locations, practical action, and a marketing campaign designed to convert decades of familiarity into new ticket sales. The reported production budget was approximately $47.5 to $50 million. That number should be treated as the production investment rather than the complete cost of bringing the movie to audiences. A studio also has to finance development, marketing, distribution, prints or theatrical servicing, and other expenses. The distinction matters because a film does not become profitable simply because its worldwide box office is higher than its production budget. Theatrical revenue is shared with exhibitors, and the studio's actual return depends on the terms of each market and on costs outside the headline production figure. The budget nevertheless tells us something important about the production strategy. The filmmakers were not operating with the financial freedom of the largest Hollywood blockbusters. They had to decide which elements deserved serious expenditure and which could be achieved through simpler methods. The answer was to concentrate resources on the things audiences most strongly associated with the product. Sylvester Stallone, real locations, weapons, stunts, explosions, practical violence, and a large climactic battle. This is capital allocation in its most practical form. If the audience is paying to experience physical action, money spent making action feel physical can generate more perceived value than money spent polishing elements that the audience barely notices. A real jungle can provide enormous production value without requiring digital construction. Practical effects can create convincing physical consequences. Multiple cameras can protect expensive action events by capturing them from several angles. And an established character can reduce the financial burden of introducing a completely unknown property. The franchise itself was therefore an economic asset. Earlier films had already paid the cost of establishing Rambo as a cultural icon. Audiences knew the name, the silhouette, the personality, and the basic promise. The new production could use that accumulated recognition as a form of customer acquisition. But recognition is not the same as demand. The studio still had to convince viewers that this particular return was worth paying for, especially after roughly 2 decades away from the previous theatrical installment. That is where the age of the character became commercially useful rather than simply problematic. Stallone did not attempt to hide the passage of time. The story acknowledges that Rambo has withdrawn from the world and built a quieter existence. The marketing could therefore sell 2 things at once: nostalgia and novelty. Older viewers could recognize the character they remembered, while younger viewers could encounter an unusually brutal modern action film built around an iconic figure they may have known primarily through popular culture. The film's R rating also helped clarify the product. A restricted rating limits the potential audience, but it can strengthen conversion among the people who actually want the experience being offered. The production was not trying to maximize family attendance or appeal equally to every demographic. It was selling adult action with extreme physical violence. In economic terms, the studio accepted a narrower addressable market in exchange for a much clearer product identity. The theatrical result provides the most useful measure of that strategy. The film earned approximately $113.2 million worldwide, including roughly $42.7 million domestically. Against a production budget in the neighborhood of $47.5 to $50 million, those figures show substantial revenue generation, but they should not be interpreted as a simple 2-to-1 profit. The studio did not receive every dollar of ticket sales, and marketing and distribution expenses still had to be recovered. The correct conclusion is more restrained. The film generated enough worldwide theatrical revenue to demonstrate that the franchise remained commercially viable. International revenue was particularly important. A significant majority of the theatrical gross came from outside the United States and Canada. That matters because an established action character can possess cultural recognition across borders even when the specific historical setting is unfamiliar. Stallone's physical persona, the Rambo name, and the universal language of action required relatively little translation. The franchise could therefore monetize recognition across multiple territories. Marketing was another major component of the investment. The campaign had to reintroduce a character who had been absent from theaters for years while communicating that this version would be substantially more graphic. Television advertising, trailers, outdoor campaigns, publicity, and distinctive poster artwork all contributed to the process. The famous Times Square campaign, including the striking stencil-style image of Stallone, gave the film a visual identity that could attract attention beyond conventional action advertising. This is where marketing ROI becomes different from simple advertising expenditure. A billboard is not valuable only because of the people who physically pass it. A distinctive image can be photographed, discussed, reproduced, and reported on, generating earned exposure. The strongest promotional assets can therefore multiply their own reach. The campaign was effectively trying to transform paid attention into unpaid attention and then transform attention into ticket purchases. Audience targeting also mattered. The film's core audience was expected to be male and strongly interested in action, while the campaign also sought younger viewers. Contemporary reporting indicated that the opening audience included a substantial proportion of younger males. This suggests that the franchise was not relying exclusively on people who had grown up with the earlier films. It was attempting to extend the customer base by presenting Rambo as a contemporary action experience. The opening weekend provides another useful financial signal. The film opened to approximately $18.2 million domestically and finished with roughly $42.7 million in the domestic market. That pattern suggests that the strongest demand was concentrated around the launch, which is common for recognizable franchise products. People who were already interested could be reached by the campaign and converted quickly, while the film did not develop the kind of extraordinary word-of-mouth momentum that produces very long theatrical legs. Home entertainment then became another revenue window, extending the film beyond its theatrical run. A movie is not a single transaction. It is an asset that can generate value across multiple release windows. The theatrical campaign creates awareness, the box office measures immediate demand, and later releases continue monetizing the same investment commercially after its cinema run ends. Technology in filmmaking is valuable when it changes what the audience can feel. A camera specification means little by itself. A lens matters when it changes distance, scale, or intimacy. A visual effect matters when it makes an event convincing. Editing technology matters when it turns thousands of fragments into one experience. In this film, technology works best when it remains invisible. The audience should believe in the physical world that the equipment captures. The production photographed the film on 35mm film using the Super 35 format, with camera systems including the Aerocam LT and ST, an Aeroflex 235, and an Aeroflex 435 Extreme. That choice is significant because the film arrived during a period when digital cinematography was rapidly becoming more common. Instead of abandoning photochemical capture, the filmmakers used film to preserve texture, density, and the organic character of the locations. The technology was therefore selected according to the visual identity the production wanted. The environment was one of the film's greatest technological advantages. Real jungle, rivers, caves, mountains, mud, weather, smoke, and vegetation provide an enormous amount of natural information. A computer-generated jungle requires artists to construct countless layers of detail. A real jungle supplies those layers automatically. The camera simply has to capture them. This is a form of natural production value, where the physical world performs part of the work that would otherwise require expensive digital labor. The lens package reinforced that approach. Zeiss Ultra Prime lenses provided a consistent set of high-quality prime lenses, while Angenia's Optimo zooms offered flexibility during unpredictable action. Prime lenses encourage deliberate framing and precise optical choices. Zoom lenses can help a camera team respond quickly when movement cannot be perfectly rehearsed. On a production involving dangerous stunts, vehicles, explosions, and large groups of performers, that flexibility has practical economic value. The widescreen composition became a technical storytelling tool. The film was presented in a 2.35:1 aspect ratio, giving the camera substantial horizontal space. That width allows the environment to remain important even when the characters are close to the camera. A river can stretch across the frame. A group of soldiers can occupy a distant layer. A single person can appear small against the landscape. The format therefore supports one of the film's central visual ideas. The individual is constantly surrounded by something larger. The camera movement changes according to the emotional requirement of the scene. Quiet sequences can remain relatively controlled, allowing the audience to observe faces and geography. Action sequences can become more aggressive, creating instability and urgency. This variation matters because permanent visual chaos quickly becomes normal. If every shot shakes, moves, and cuts at maximum intensity, the audience eventually stops noticing the intensity. Control creates a baseline from which chaos can become meaningful. Lighting follows the physical conditions of the locations rather than making the jungle look artificially polished. Daylight, deep shade, fire, smoke, and darkness create different photographic problems. Faces must remain readable, but the environment must continue to feel dangerous and natural. The objective is not beauty lighting. It is legibility and atmosphere. The audience needs to see the people while still believing that they are actually inside the environment. Film stock was particularly useful for difficult lighting. The production used Kodak Vision 2500T52AT negative, giving the cinematographer flexibility in lower light situations. That matters in caves, jungle interiors, night sequences, and scenes where artificial illumination must remain limited. The resulting image can preserve shadow detail while retaining the grain and texture associated with film. Those characteristics contribute to the movie's tactile visual identity. The digital intermediate connected physical capture to modern post-production. After the negative was transferred into a digital workflow, the filmmakers could refine color, visual effects, and consistency across material photographed under very different conditions. A production moving between jungle, villages, caves, interiors, and battlefields needs a system that can make those environments feel like one world. Digital finishing provides that control. Practical effects were equally important. Explosions, weapons, blood effects, vehicles, stunts, and physical destruction create real interactions between bodies and environments. When an actor moves through mud, the mud reacts. When an explosion occurs near a structure, smoke and debris move through the same space as the camera. These interactions contain visual information that is difficult to reproduce perfectly through computer graphics. Practical filmmaking, therefore, creates authenticity that audiences can perceive even when they cannot explain why an image feels convincing. The production also used multiple cameras during major action. That is a technological decision with a strong financial logic. A dangerous stunt or a large explosion may be difficult or impossible to repeat. Capturing the event from several angles increases the probability of obtaining usable material and gives editors more options. More cameras create additional costs, including operators, assistants, media management, and editorial workload, but those costs can be justified when the alternative is risking an expensive event that may only happen once. The climactic battle pushes this principle further. Large numbers of performers, weapons, explosions, smoke, vehicles, and practical effects create an enormous quantity of moving information. Multiple cameras protect the production against uncertainty, while editing later determines which pieces create the strongest sequence. Technology therefore works in two stages. First, it captures possibilities. Afterward, the editorial system converts those possibilities into a controlled experience. Editing is particularly important because action photography naturally produces more material than the audience will ever see. The editor has to understand geography, continuity, rhythm, performance, and emotional emphasis simultaneously. A shot may be technically impressive, but useless if it destroys spatial understanding. Another shot may be visually simple but essential because it tells the audience where a character is standing. Editorial intelligence determines which images deserve to survive. Color finishing completes the technological pipeline. The final grade can reinforce the film's earthy greens, muted browns, dark shadows, smoke, fire, and blood-red accents. Color becomes both a technical correction system and an emotional tool. A restrained palette makes fire more intense. Darker environments increase tension. Warm highlights can attract attention against cooler surroundings. The technology of color science, therefore, becomes part of the storytelling language. What makes this workflow effective is its discipline. The filmmakers are not using technology simply because more technology is available. They are choosing tools according to the demands of the story. Film creates texture. Real locations create complexity. Lenses control perspective. Multiple cameras protect action. Practical effects create physical interaction. Digital finishing provides precision. Editing organizes the material. Color unifies the result. This is why the movie can feel unusually physical even though it was produced with modern post-production technology. The digital workflow does not erase the physical world. It helps preserve and shape it. That distinction is important in an era when audiences can become sensitive to images that look completely synthetic. Real light, real surfaces, real performers, and real environments provide information that technology can manipulate but does not always need to manufacture. From an ROI perspective, the lesson is simple. The best production technology is not necessarily the most expensive technology. It is the technology that produces the greatest improvement in audience experience for the resources invested. In this case, a real jungle may create more value per dollar than a digital jungle. A practical explosion may feel more convincing than a completely artificial one. A film camera may contribute more to the desired atmosphere than a newer digital system. Technology becomes valuable when it serves purpose. Ultimately, the filmmaking technology supports the same idea that drives the character. The movie is interested in physical consequences. Bodies become tired. Terrain creates resistance. Weapons have weight. Explosions produce destruction. Water and mud affect movement. The camera captures these details, the sound system gives them force, and post-production organizes them. Technology does not replace physical reality here. It amplifies it. The deeper technological achievement is the combination of photochemical tradition and modern digital control. The film uses advanced tools while retaining the rough, tactile character of practical action cinema. Cameras, lenses, film stock, practical effects, digital effects, editing, and color science ultimately disappear into one coherent physical world. A film set is a temporary company built around a single product. Hundreds of people arrive with different specialties, work toward one deadline, and then disappear when the finished product is delivered. Production management is the system that makes those separate skills function as one organization. For this film, that challenge was unusually demanding because the production combined international crews, remote locations, difficult weather, dangerous action, large groups of performers, practical effects, and a limited schedule. The central management principle was simple: time is capital. The production reportedly involved hundreds of people, including Thai crew members and international personnel from several countries. That created a multinational organization in which communication, technical standards, local knowledge, transportation, accommodation, safety, and creative direction all had to work together. A film set cannot afford to behave like a collection of independent departments. Camera depends on lighting. Stunts depend on camera. Effects depend on safety. Sound depends on the environment. Editorial depends on every department delivering usable material. Location management was one of the largest operational challenges. The filmmakers wanted the physical authenticity of Thailand and the region around the Thai-Burmese border, but remote environments create costs that a studio soundstage does not. People and equipment have to travel. Roads can be difficult. Weather can change suddenly. Food, water, communications, medical preparation, and emergency procedures become essential. Every hour spent moving a large crew is an hour that cannot be spent photographing the movie. This is why production management is really the discipline of converting logistical time into creative time. A delayed vehicle can delay an entire unit. A weather interruption can eliminate a planned shot. A damaged piece of equipment can stop a department. A performer becoming unavailable can affect continuity and scheduling. Small disruptions multiply because a film set is highly interconnected. Good management, therefore, does not merely keep people busy. It protects the chain of dependencies that allows the camera to keep rolling. The real locations also required environmental and governmental coordination. Some filming took place in protected natural areas, where permits and restrictions were necessary. Working inside such environments means the production cannot treat nature as an empty backlit. Access, movement, equipment, noise, and the physical footprint of hundreds of people must be controlled. The landscape may provide enormous production value, but that value comes with responsibility and operational constraints. The production also had to integrate local expertise with international departments. Thai crew members understood the locations, local infrastructure, and practical realities of working in the country. Foreign specialists brought experience in areas such as cinematography, stunts, effects, and production leadership. This combination can be extremely efficient when properly coordinated. Local knowledge reduces friction, while specialized international personnel provide capabilities that may not be available everywhere. At the center of the hierarchy was Sylvester Stallone, who served not only as the lead actor, but also as director. That created a particularly concentrated creative leadership structure. He had to make decisions about performance, action, tone, camera coverage, and the character's psychological direction while also managing the enormous practical demands of production. When the person carrying the central character is also directing the film, the pressure on preparation and communication increases substantially. Creative flexibility created another management challenge. Stallone has described making rewrites during production, sometimes changing material very close to the time it was filmed. Rewriting can improve a scene when the director discovers something useful through rehearsal or performance, but it also creates downstream costs. A change in dialogue can affect blocking, continuity, props, costumes, scheduling, and editorial structure. Flexibility is valuable only when a production has enough organization to absorb it. Action sequences increase that complexity dramatically. The production used large numbers of stunt performers and extras, while major sequences required multiple cameras and extensive practical effects. A stunt is not simply an actor performing a movement. It is a coordinated operation involving performers, stunt coordinators, camera teams, effects personnel, safety staff, assistants, and often medical planning. Everyone must know where bodies, vehicles, weapons, and effects will be at specific moments. Multiple cameras can therefore be understood as an insurance policy against lost production value. If a dangerous event can only be performed once, capturing it from several angles reduces the risk that the production will have to repeat it. More cameras cost more money, but a reshoot can cost much more. The management decision is therefore based on expected value. Spend additional resources now to reduce the probability of losing an expensive event later. Practical effects create the same calculation. An explosion, vehicle destruction, or large physical effect may be difficult to reset. Once it happens, the production has one opportunity to obtain the footage. Rehearsal becomes financially valuable because preparation reduces uncertainty. The objective is not to remove all risk, which is impossible in action filmmaking. It is to control risk well enough that the planned creative result can be achieved without wasting the capital already committed. Safety becomes especially important because the production operated in physically demanding environments. Jungle terrain, water, weather, weapons, explosions, vehicles, and large groups of performers create many potential hazards. The reports of dangerous conditions near the Myanmar border make the production's risk management even more striking. A production manager has to balance the value of authenticity against the responsibility to protect the people creating it. At some point, no image is worth an unacceptable human cost. The budget also shaped management decisions. With a production investment around $47.5 to $50 million, inefficiency could not simply be absorbed indefinitely. Every additional shooting day creates costs for crew, equipment, locations, accommodation, transportation, and post-production. This makes the schedule a financial instrument. A day is not merely a date on a calendar. It represents a package of capital that has to produce enough usable footage to justify its expense. That principle explains why preparation is so important. The production needs to know what it is trying to capture before expensive resources are assembled. Storyboards, rehearsals, location planning, camera plans, stunt preparation, effects testing, and departmental coordination all reduce uncertainty. The audience never sees most of this work, but it determines whether the final sequence feels controlled or chaotic. Production management therefore protects not only the shooting schedule, but the film's eventual ROI. When preparation works, expensive resources are concentrated where they create the greatest audience value, and the final sequence can feel effortless even though hundreds of people made that apparent simplicity possible. Historical realism becomes especially important when a film places fictional characters inside a real conflict. The audience is not only being asked to believe in a story, it is also being given an interpretation of geography, warfare, civilians, weapons, and political violence. The challenge is to separate what is grounded in documented reality from what exists primarily for commercial action storytelling. The conflict in Burma, now commonly called Myanmar, provides a genuine historical foundation. The Karen conflict had continued for decades before the film was made, and Karen communities had experienced displacement, military offensives, forced labor, landmines, and attacks on civilians. The film's humanitarian crisis, therefore, does not come from an imaginary geopolitical problem. It draws emotional power from conditions that existed in the real world. The timing also matters. The story emerged during a period when Burma was under military rule and international attention was focused on political repression and unrest. The 2007 Saffron Revolution, involving Buddhist monks and civilians, had recently brought the country into international headlines. The film uses that atmosphere as part of its context, giving the fictional narrative a recognizable historical moment. Geography is another strong point of authenticity. The film's rivers, jungle, mountains, villages, and border environment are based on real landscapes in and around Thailand. The Salween River is an important geographical feature of the region. Using real terrain gives the story physical credibility that would be difficult to reproduce entirely on a soundstage. The audience can feel that the characters are moving through a place with real distance, weather, and natural obstacles. The humanitarian premise is also broadly credible. During this period, international aid organizations and religious groups were attempting to provide assistance in areas affected by conflict, while access to some communities was heavily restricted. The film dramatizes one such mission, but the underlying problem was real. People attempting to deliver humanitarian assistance could face serious logistical, political, and security risks. Landmines are another area where the film connects directly with documented history. Mines had been used by government forces and armed groups in the region, and civilians could suffer long after fighting moved elsewhere. A minefield is therefore not simply an action movie invention. What cinema changes is the time scale. A long-term crisis involving displacement, injury, and restricted movement becomes a concentrated sequence of suspense. The same distinction applies to the military. The Tatmadaw was a real institution, and reports from the period documented serious abuses against civilians in ethnic conflict zones. The film's military antagonist, however, is fictional. He functions as a dramatic concentration of the brutality represented in the story. That makes the conflict easier to understand, but it also removes much of the institutional complexity of real warfare. Real conflicts rarely divide neatly into one completely innocent side and one completely evil side. They involve competing political interests, armed organizations, civilians, local communities, foreign governments, and changing alliances. The film simplifies those relationships because its primary purpose is not to provide a comprehensive political history. It needs a clear emotional structure for a 91-minute action narrative. This creates an important distinction between historical foundation and historical reconstruction. The foundation is credible. The conflict, humanitarian suffering, geography, military government, and landmines correspond to real conditions. The reconstruction is fictional. Rambo, the rescue mission, the mercenary team, the specific commander, and the sequence of battles exist primarily to serve the story. The weapons follow a similar pattern. The firearms and heavy weapons shown are based on real military technology. The M2 Browning, for example, is a genuine heavy machine gun. But a real weapon does not mean every scene involving it is tactically realistic. Action cinema compresses time, exaggerates individual capability, and organizes combat around dramatic beats rather than the slower complexity of actual military operations. Rambo's effectiveness is the clearest example. His abilities are grounded in the character's established identity, but his capacity to influence a large battlefield belongs to action movie mythology. Real combat depends on intelligence, communications, supply, coordination, numbers, terrain, and command structures. The film concentrates those variables around a small group of highly capable individuals so the audience can follow the story without requiring a military operations manual. The mercenary team is similarly simplified. Private security and military contractors exist in real conflict environments, but the film assembles a convenient group of specialists around its rescue objective. Each member has a recognizable skill and narrative function. This is excellent screenplay economics because the audience can understand the team quickly, but it should not be mistaken for a complete representation of humanitarian rescue operations. There is, however, an element of authenticity in the production itself. The filmmakers worked in real environments near the Thai-Myanmar border and encountered difficult conditions. Stallone has described the danger involved in working near the border, including reports of gunfire passing over the production. Those experiences do not make the movie a documentary, but they demonstrate that the physical environment was not simply being imagined from a distant studio. The film's depiction of violence should therefore be interpreted carefully. Some brutality reflects documented realities of warfare, particularly civilian vulnerability. But its intensity, timing, and concentration are deliberately cinematic. The audience receives a much denser experience than an ordinary historical account would provide. Violence becomes a mechanism for shock, urgency, and escalation. The most responsible interpretation is therefore neither to call the film historically accurate nor to dismiss it as completely fictional. It is historically grounded, but dramatically compressed. The real conflict supplies the moral and geographical foundation. Hollywood supplies the characters, pacing, action structure, and resolution. The result is an interpretation designed to make a distant humanitarian crisis emotionally immediate for a mass audience. That approach has both educational value and risk. Its value is that a viewer who knows little about the Karen conflict may become curious about the real history. Its risk is that the simplicity of the movie can become the viewer's entire understanding of that history. The film gives us an entry point, not a complete historical record. Ultimately, the strongest factual elements are those that exist independently of the fictional hero. The conflict was real, the humanitarian suffering was real, the geography was real, and military repression was documented. The greatest liberties occur where the story requires a concentrated hero, villain, mission, and battlefield. Understanding that boundary lets us appreciate the film's realism without confusing cinematic drama for historical evidence. A landscape can tell a story before a character speaks. In this film, the jungle is not simply a background for combat. It is a visual machine that creates isolation, scale, danger, and physical pressure. The cinematography by Glenn McPherson uses the natural environment to make people appear vulnerable inside a world that is larger, darker, and more unpredictable than they are. The camera is therefore doing more than recording action. It is engineering the audience's attention. The film was photographed on 35mm film using the Super 35 format, with professional camera systems including the Aerocam LT and ST, an Aeroflex 235, and an Aeroflex 435 Extreme. The choice of film is significant because the production arrived during a period when digital cinematography was rapidly becoming more common. Photochemical capture preserved texture and a tactile quality that suited the harsh environments. Later digital finishing gave the filmmakers the precision needed to unify material captured under very different conditions. The widescreen frame is one of the most important compositional tools. Presented at approximately 2.35:1, the image can contain both human figures and large areas of environment. A character can occupy one part of the frame while rivers, trees, mountains, smoke, or distant soldiers occupy the rest. This creates a constant relationship between the individual and the world around him. Rambo may be physically powerful, but the frame reminds us that he is still a small human figure inside an enormous environment. That relationship becomes psychologically important. His early life is built around distance. He lives near the river, works quietly, and keeps emotional separation from the violence around him. The cinematography allows space to communicate that isolation. Later, as the story moves deeper into conflict, the frame becomes more crowded with people, weapons, smoke, fire, and movement. The visual language, therefore, follows the psychological movement from distance toward confrontation. The color palette supports the same idea. The jungle is not presented primarily as a beautiful tropical postcard. Greens are often dense and subdued, while brown earth, mud, gray smoke, dark clothing, and shadow occupy much of the image. That restraint gives the environment a weathered physical quality. It also creates useful color contrast. When fire or blood appears, its warmer tones become visually aggressive because they are surrounded by relatively muted colors. Lighting is similarly grounded in the environment. Daylight, deep jungle shade, caves, fire, smoke, and darkness create different photographic conditions. The goal is not polished studio beauty. It is legibility combined with atmosphere. Faces need enough light to remain readable, but the world must still feel dangerous and uncontrolled. Natural conditions therefore become part of the visual design rather than obstacles that the cinematographer simply tries to eliminate. The lens choices add another layer of control. Zeiss Ultra Primes provide consistent prime lens characteristics, while Angenia's Optimo zooms offer flexibility during complicated movement. Wider perspectives can place the viewer close to a character while preserving the surrounding environment. Longer focal lengths can compress distance and make groups of people feel more densely packed. The cinematographer can therefore change the audience's perception of space without changing the location itself. Wide compositions are especially useful in the jungle because they preserve environmental geography. The viewer can understand where a character is relative to trees, water, roads, buildings, or other people. That matters in action cinema. If the audience cannot understand where bodies are located, danger becomes abstract. A strong action image should create both excitement and spatial comprehension. The camera must allow the viewer to feel the event while still understanding enough of its geography. Close compositions perform the opposite function. They isolate faces, weapons, injuries, and reactions. This increases intimacy and physical discomfort. The contrast between wide and close photography creates emotional rhythm. A wide shot can communicate the scale of violence, while a close shot communicates its personal cost. The film needs both perspectives because the conflict is simultaneously a large military event and a collection of individual human experiences. Camera movement follows the same principle of controlled escalation. If every shot were violently unstable, the audience would quickly adapt to that visual intensity. By allowing some scenes to remain comparatively steady, the production creates a baseline. When movement becomes more aggressive during combat, the difference is noticeable. Control makes chaos more effective. Smoke and fire become important visual tools during the major action. Smoke reduces visibility, creates layers of depth, and allows light to become visible inside the frame. Fire introduces warm highlights against darker surroundings and produces constantly changing illumination. Together, they transform the battlefield into a shifting visual environment. The audience is not simply looking at objects. It is watching light, atmosphere, bodies, and particles interact. Blood serves a similar compositional purpose. Against green vegetation, brown earth, and dark clothing, red immediately attracts attention. Because the film deliberately embraces graphic violence, blood becomes part of its visual language rather than a minor detail. It communicates injury while also creating strong contrast. The production's decision to use practical physical effects therefore contributes to both realism and visual emphasis. Real locations provide perhaps the greatest visual return on investment. A real jungle contains depth, texture, movement, weather, and atmospheric complexity that would be expensive to construct digitally. Leaves move independently. Water reflects changing light. Mud reacts to footsteps. Smoke interacts with vegetation. The camera captures these relationships automatically. The location therefore performs part of the visual effects workload without requiring a computer-generated environment. The caves create a different visual problem. Darkness limits information and forces the cinematographer to control exactly what the audience can see. Small sources of light can reveal only portions of a face or a space. That restriction creates tension because danger can exist outside the visible area. Bright environments allow viewers to anticipate threats from a distance. Darkness makes information itself uncertain. The military forces are also organized visually in opposition to Rambo. Groups of soldiers, weapons, uniforms, and vehicles create repeated patterns that make the military appear like a larger system. Rambo is more often isolated as an individual. This visual contrast reinforces one of the film's central ideas: one person against an organized force. Composition therefore contributes to character mythology without requiring dialogue. The digital intermediate then becomes the final stage of visual engineering. Material captured in rivers, jungle, villages, caves, interiors, and battlefields can be balanced so that the locations feel like parts of one coherent world. Color correction and grading can strengthen the intended palette, maintain continuity, and control contrast. Digital finishing does not replace the physical environment. It organizes the material captured from it. What makes the cinematography effective is that its technical choices are connected to the character's psychology. The film begins with space because Rambo wants distance. It gradually fills that space with danger because the story is forcing him back toward the identity he rejected. Darkness increases uncertainty. Smoke obscures information. Fire creates violent contrast. Crowded compositions reduce escape. The visual language is therefore quietly telling the same story as the screenplay. The deeper lesson is that cinematography is not simply about making images attractive. It is about controlling scale, attention, information, and emotion. A lens determines how near the world feels. Composition determines what matters. Lighting determines what can be understood. Color determines what attracts the eye. Camera movement determines how stable the viewer feels. And the combination can make a real location become part of a character's psychological experience. Sound is the invisible architecture of physical cinema. We see a weapon fire, but sound tells us how close it feels. We see an explosion, but low frequencies tell the body how powerful it is. We see a quiet river, but water, insects, wind, and distant movement can make the landscape feel alive. In Rambo, sound therefore creates a second environment around the image, making the jungle feel larger, the weapons more dangerous, and the return to violence more emotionally intense. Brian Tyler's score had to connect this film with the musical identity established by Jerry Goldsmith. The audience already associated Rambo with a recognizable musical language, so abandoning that history would weaken the franchise's continuity. But simply copying the older scores would make the film feel like nostalgia without reinvention. Tyler therefore combined new orchestral material with established thematic ideas. The result sounds contemporary while carrying the memory of the earlier films. That is brand equity expressed through sound. A familiar theme can trigger recognition before the audience consciously identifies it. The music tells viewers that the person on screen belongs to a larger history. In a legacy sequel, that is extremely valuable because the character's past is part of the product. A musical phrase can communicate decades of identity within seconds. The opening benefits from restraint. Rambo's life is quiet, so environmental sound establishes that quietness. River water, wind, insects, engines, footsteps, and distant natural activity create a world separate from military life. Psychologically, this represents the distance Rambo has created between himself and war. When the soundtrack later becomes dominated by weapons and explosions, the audience can feel how far he has been pulled from that earlier state. This is the principle of dynamic range. If every scene is loud, loudness stops being meaningful. Quiet establishes a baseline, moderate sound creates anticipation, and sudden violence produces impact. The soundtrack is therefore managing expectation as much as volume. Gunfire is particularly important because weapons need distinct acoustic identities. A pistol, rifle, automatic weapon, and heavy machine gun should not sound interchangeable. Their reports, mechanical sounds, reverberation, and environmental reflections can be layered to create different physical personalities. The audience may not consciously analyze these differences, but the brain uses them to understand the scale and character of the action. The jungle adds another dimension because sound can extend beyond the camera's field of view. A bird, vehicle, distant voice, river, or gunshot can originate somewhere the audience cannot see. This makes the environment feel three-dimensional. The image shows one portion of the world while the soundtrack suggests everything around it. In a forest, that unseen acoustic space is particularly powerful. Foley supplies the small physical details that make the world believable. Footsteps, clothing movement, weapons being handled, bodies striking surfaces, equipment shifting, and movement through vegetation all contribute to material realism. A character walking through mud should sound different from one walking across dry ground. These details give bodies and objects weight. Dialogue creates a competing requirement. Characters must remain understandable while surrounded by engines, wind, weapons, explosions, and environmental noise. Dialogue editing and mixing therefore require careful prioritization. When information matters, other elements can fall away. When atmosphere matters, the environment can become more prominent. The mixer is constantly deciding what the audience should hear first. Re-recording mixing brings dialogue, music, Foley, effects, and ambience into one acoustic system. The objective is not simply maximum volume. An explosion may dominate for a moment, then fall away so a reaction can be heard. Music may rise during a transition and retreat when physical effects become important. Environmental ambience can become prominent when the story needs isolation. Every decision changes the emotional hierarchy. The climactic battle creates the greatest challenge. Gunfire, explosions, impacts, vehicles, shouting, movement, environmental noise, and music all compete for attention. The answer is layers of chaos. Foreground sounds communicate immediate events, background ambience establishes location, and music supplies emotional interpretation. The audience can feel overwhelmed without the soundtrack becoming meaningless noise. Low-frequency sound gives large action physical scale. Explosions contain energy that theatrical subwoofers can reproduce as vibration as well as sound. That contributes to the perception that events are physically happening around the audience. Sound, therefore, becomes part of the theatrical value proposition, not merely an accompaniment to the picture. Spatial mixing extends the world beyond the screen. Surround channels allow environmental information and effects to occupy different parts of the acoustic field. A vehicle can approach from outside the frame. Gunfire can appear to originate from another direction. Wind and ambience can surround the listener. The audience therefore feels placed inside the environment rather than simply positioned in front of an image. Music must coexist with this physical information. Tyler's orchestral writing contains percussion, brass, strings, and low frequencies, while explosions and weapons occupy many of the same ranges. The mix needs separation. If music dominates, action loses physical impact. If effects dominate constantly, emotional scoring disappears. The strongest moments allow both systems to support one another. Sound also follows the character's psychological progression. Early music can remain restrained because Rambo is trying to stay detached. As circumstances force him toward violence, the score becomes more powerful and familiar thematic material gains emotional meaning. The music is not simply telling us that action has arrived. It is signaling that an identity Rambo tried to suppress has returned. Editing is inseparable from this process. Gunshots must align with weapons. Impacts must arrive with physical events. Footsteps must match movement. Musical accents can reinforce cuts. These details create the illusion that picture and sound were produced simultaneously, even though much of the soundtrack is designed during post-production. Sound is therefore an editorial construction. From an economic perspective, sound can create enormous perceived production value. A weak explosion can make an expensive scene feel cheap. A convincing weapon sound can make a practical effect feel larger. A strong musical theme can make an old character feel important. Detailed ambience can make a real location feel expansive. The soundtrack multiplies the value of what has already been photographed. Ultimately, the sound design follows the same principle as the cinematography. Physical reality should create emotional reality. Water should sound wet. Weapons should sound dangerous. The jungle should sound alive. Explosions should have weight. Silence should feel tense. Music should carry memory. By combining environmental sound, Foley, dialogue editing, practical effects, orchestral scoring, spatial mixing, and dynamic range, the soundtrack turns photographed events into an experience the audience can hear as well as see. A movie can be brilliantly made and still fail if nobody knows why they should watch it. Marketing is the bridge between the finished production and the audience, and for a legacy action film, that bridge has a particularly difficult job. The character is already famous, but fame alone does not guarantee a ticket sale. The campaign has to turn recognition into curiosity, curiosity into urgency, and urgency into a purchase. For this film, the central marketing challenge was to make an older franchise feel relevant to a new generation without losing the audience that remembered the character. The greatest asset was brand awareness. The name Rambo already carried decades of recognition, and Sylvester Stallone's face was inseparable from that identity. The studio, therefore, did not have to spend its entire campaign explaining who the protagonist was. A poster, trailer, or television spot could communicate the product almost instantly. The audience already understood the basic promise: a hardened warrior, a dangerous environment, and extreme action. That dramatically reduced the educational cost of customer acquisition. But recognition creates a second problem. People may recognize a character without believing that they need another film about him. The campaign therefore had to answer a simple question: why return now? The answer was built around Stallone's age, the character's long absence, and the promise of unusually intense violence. The film was not presented as a gentle, nostalgic reunion. It was positioned as a harder, more contemporary version of an established action icon. That positioning is important because marketing works best when the product promise is clear. The R rating immediately communicated that the experience was intended for an adult audience. The trailers emphasized danger, weapons, brutality, and Stallone's physical presence. Rather than trying to make the film attractive to everyone, the campaign focused on people most likely to want exactly this type of action. In modern marketing language, that is targeting rather than simple mass exposure. The campaign also had to bridge generations. Older viewers possess strong emotional familiarity with the character, while younger viewers might know the name without having grown up with the original films. Contemporary marketing efforts therefore targeted younger male audiences through television placements associated with action-oriented and male-skewing programming. The objective was not to replace the original audience, but to expand the addressable market. A franchise becomes more valuable when nostalgia can be converted into new customer acquisition. The theatrical trailer performed another important function. It created a narrative question without answering it completely. Rambo is living quietly, then circumstances pull him toward violence. The audience can see enough action to understand the product, but the full outcome remains hidden. This creates anticipation. Good trailers do not need to explain every plot point. They need to make viewers believe that the unresolved question is worth paying to answer. The campaign's visual identity was especially strong. Marketing executive Tim Palin developed a striking stencil-style image of Stallone that was displayed prominently, including a major Times Square placement. The design helped transform Rambo from a photographic action hero into a graphic symbol. That matters because advertising competes for attention in crowded environments. A distinctive image has a greater chance of being remembered, discussed, photographed, and reproduced than a generic character poster. This is where paid media and earned media begin to overlap. The studio pays for an outdoor placement, but if the image attracts enough attention, people photograph it and media organizations discuss it. Those secondary impressions are not identical to the original advertising purchase. They are additional exposure generated by the creative asset itself. In financial terms, strong creative can increase the return obtained from a fixed media investment. The theatrical launch then converted awareness into measurable behavior. The film opened in approximately 2,751 North American theaters and earned about $18.2 million during its opening weekend. That immediate response demonstrates that the campaign succeeded in creating a significant amount of launch demand. It did not need audiences to slowly discover the film over many weeks. The objective was to bring the strongest concentration of interested viewers into theaters quickly. Audience composition provides another useful marketing signal. Contemporary reporting indicated that a substantial portion of the opening audience was younger than 25, and that roughly two-thirds was male. Those figures suggest that the campaign reached beyond the aging audience associated with the earlier films. The franchise was successfully presented as a current action product rather than simply an artifact from the 1980s and 1990s. CPM, or cost per thousand impressions, helps explain the logic behind such targeting. The exact campaign-wide CPM cannot be calculated without complete media spend and impression data, but the principle remains useful. An impression is not equally valuable if the person receiving it has no interest in the product. A cheaper impression among an irrelevant audience may generate less value than a more expensive impression reaching someone highly likely to buy a ticket. Marketing efficiency, therefore, depends on relevance as well as reach. The international market expanded that opportunity. The film earned a substantial majority of its theatrical revenue outside North America, demonstrating that the Rambo brand could travel across territories. Action is unusually exportable because its core emotional language requires relatively little cultural explanation. The character's physical identity, weapons, survival skills, and conflict are immediately understandable. International marketing could therefore build on the same brand foundation while adapting distribution and promotion to individual markets. After the theatrical window, home entertainment extended the property's commercial life. This is important because a movie is not a single transaction. It is an asset with multiple revenue windows. A viewer can encounter the trailer, buy a theatrical ticket, later rent or purchase the film, and eventually encounter it through television or another distribution platform. Every window can recover part of the original investment and increase the property's lifetime value. The campaign's overall strategy can therefore be understood as a sequence of psychological conversions. First comes recognition. I know this character. Then relevance. This version looks different. Then curiosity. What happened to him? Then anticipation. How far will the story go? Then purchase. I want to see it now. The strongest marketing campaigns understand that each stage prepares the audience for the next. The result was not a universally appealing product, and it did not need to be. The campaign sold a specific experience to a specific audience. That clarity helped transform an aging franchise into a contemporary theatrical product. Its marketing did not simply remind audiences that Rambo existed. It gave them a reason to believe that this particular return was worth their attention and money. A film's reputation is rarely decided on opening weekend. Critics provide the first interpretation, audiences provide another, and time creates a third. This film arrived carrying an unusual burden because it was not simply a new action movie. It was the return of one of cinema's most recognizable warriors after a long absence. That meant its reception would inevitably be measured against both contemporary standards and memories of what the character had once represented. The critical response was mixed. Some reviewers respected the film's commitment to physical action, Stallone's presence, and its willingness to return to a harder style of filmmaking. Others objected to the extreme violence, simplified storytelling, and the way a real humanitarian conflict was transformed into an action spectacle. The disagreement is revealing because it shows that the film's strongest creative decision was also its greatest commercial and critical risk. Its audience response was meaningfully stronger than its professional critical reception. That distinction matters when evaluating a commercial franchise. Critics are an influential group, but they are not the entire market. A film can receive moderate reviews and still satisfy a highly motivated audience. Here, the worldwide theatrical result of approximately $113.2 million against a production budget of roughly $47.5 to $50 million indicates that the Rambo brand still possessed substantial market value. The film's awards history tells a more specialized story. It was not positioned as an awards season prestige contender, and it did not become a major Academy Awards or Golden Globes presence. Its recognition was more closely connected to the areas in which the production had concentrated its strengths: action and marketing. That is strategically consistent. Awards do not exist independently of a film's identity. Recognition often follows the aspects that critics, audiences, or industry organizations find most distinctive. The marketing campaign received notable recognition for its visual work, including a Golden Trailer Award for the stencil-style poster. That design transformed Stallone's familiar image into a stark graphic symbol. It was simple enough to communicate immediately, but distinctive enough to stand apart from ordinary action advertising. In commercial terms, the poster demonstrated how a strong visual identity can become an asset beyond the film itself. The climactic action also received recognition through a Golden Schmoes nomination for Best Action Sequence of the Year. The nomination placed the film in a competitive field of major action productions from the same period. Even without winning, the recognition confirms that the final battle was regarded as one of the production's notable genre achievements. The sequence became part of the film's identity, which is particularly valuable for a movie whose primary customer promise was physical action. Its legacy becomes more interesting when viewed through Sylvester Stallone's career. The return was part of a broader period in which he demonstrated that aging action icons could become commercially viable again by acknowledging their age rather than hiding it. The character is older, quieter, and psychologically scarred. His physical competence remains, but the story no longer treats youth as an essential part of heroism. That approach helped establish a model later used by other legacy action franchises. The film also occupies a specific position within the franchise. The first entry is generally remembered for psychological realism and character depth, while the subsequent films moved increasingly toward military spectacle. This chapter deliberately combines those traditions. It restores some reluctance and emotional conflict while delivering an exceptionally violent action climax. That mixture explains both its appeal and its limitations. It is not a return to the exact form of the original, but neither is it simply a repetition of the later sequels. The production's use of real locations and practical action contributes to its long-term identity as well. It arrived during a period when digital filmmaking was rapidly expanding, yet it retained a strongly physical approach. Real environments, film photography, practical effects, stunt work, and digital post-production existed together. That makes the film useful as a snapshot of a transitional period in Hollywood technology, when traditional physical production and increasingly sophisticated digital workflows were operating side by side. The film's historical context also affects its legacy. Because the story draws from a genuine humanitarian crisis, viewers can approach it as an entry point into a conflict that many international audiences knew little about. But it should not be treated as a complete historical account. Its simplified moral structure and fictional characters serve the requirements of commercial storytelling. The most valuable educational approach is therefore to distinguish the real context from the dramatic invention rather than accepting either extreme. One of the film's strongest long-term assets is memorability. People continue to discuss its violence, its final battle, Stallone's performance, and its relationship to First Blood. That kind of discussion is commercially useful because catalog films survive partly through continued discovery. A movie that creates a strong reaction can remain relevant longer than one that is technically competent but emotionally anonymous. The continuation of the franchise provides further evidence of brand durability. More than a decade later, another theatrical Rambo film appeared, demonstrating that the character still had enough recognition to support another major production. The existence of a later sequel does not prove that every creative decision here was successful, but it does show that the 2008 return contributed to keeping the property commercially alive. From a financial perspective, the movie demonstrated that an old intellectual property could be reactivated without requiring the enormous expenditure associated with the biggest modern franchises. From a technological perspective, it showed that practical filmmaking could remain commercially powerful alongside digital post-production. From a psychological perspective, it gave an aging action hero a meaningful conflict with his own identity. And from a marketing perspective, it converted decades of recognition into a new theatrical product. The most likely long-term position is therefore neither forgotten failure nor universally celebrated masterpiece. It is a cult action film with a durable franchise identity. Its strongest sequences will continue to attract action enthusiasts, while its critical weaknesses will continue to invite debate. That combination may actually help its longevity. People rarely revisit a film because everyone agrees about it. They revisit films that give them something to argue about. Ultimately, the legacy is about successful revival. The film proved that Rambo could return, that Stallone could still carry the character, that audiences would pay to see him, and that a physical action production could compete within a changing technological environment. It did not perfect the mythology, but it extended it. In the language of business, the brand remained productive. In the language of cinema, the character remained alive. And in the language of audience psychology, the warrior still meant something to people who were willing to come back and see him fight again. Some films are remembered for their scale. Others are remembered for the character, who gives that scale a human face. This story becomes most interesting when we stop seeing the explosions as the destination and start seeing them as the final expression of a quieter struggle. Rambo has spent years trying to separate himself from violence, yet the world keeps reminding him that his greatest ability was created by the experiences that damaged him. The journey therefore ends with a question larger than combat. Can a person carry his past without allowing it to decide what he becomes? That question gives the production its structure. The story begins with isolation, moves through moral responsibility, develops into a rescue mission, and becomes a confrontation with violence on an enormous physical scale. Each department contributes to that progression. The screenplay creates psychological motivation. Production turns money and time into physical environments. The camera transforms those environments into pressure. Sound gives them weight. Editing creates rhythm. Marketing turns the finished work into a commercial proposition. Finance sits underneath all of it. A reported production investment of approximately $47.5 to $50 million had to become an experience capable of attracting audiences worldwide. The worldwide theatrical gross of approximately $113.2 million demonstrated meaningful commercial value, although gross revenue is not the same as profit. Theaters retain part of ticket sales, while marketing and distribution affect the final return. The important lesson is that a legacy property can still generate substantial revenue when its identity remains clear. Technology determines how efficiently that capital becomes cinema. The production used 35mm photography, real locations, practical effects, physical stunts, multiple cameras, and digital post-production. Instead of replacing physical filmmaking with technology, the filmmakers used technology to strengthen it. The jungle supplied complexity. Film captured texture. Practical effects supplied physical interaction. Digital finishing provided control. Editing organized the material. Sound transformed photographed events into an immersive experience. That hybrid approach is one of the film's most useful lessons. The newest tool is not automatically the best tool. A real environment can provide more value than an expensive digital environment. A practical effect can communicate weight more effectively than a completely artificial one. Good technology is not technology that attracts attention to itself. It is technology that disappears into the experience. The same principle applies to production management. A 91-minute finished film represents months of planning, travel, rehearsal, photography, editing, sound, visual effects, color finishing, and marketing. Every department consumes time, and every shooting day consumes money. The production, therefore, had to protect its schedule while operating in difficult environments and staging dangerous action. The final image may look effortless, but that simplicity is the product of thousands of coordinated decisions. Psychology gives those decisions meaning. Without Rambo's reluctance, the action would have less emotional value. Without the humanitarian mission, the violence would have less moral purpose. Without the real historical setting, the conflict would have less weight. Without physical filmmaking, the action would have less impact. The film works because these elements reinforce one another. That is why the ending matters. Returning home is not simply a physical movement. It represents a change in the direction of his life. For years, he has moved away from society and the identity associated with war. By walking toward home, he is not magically cured. He is choosing connection over permanent isolation. The warrior remains part of him, but the warrior no longer has to determine where he goes. Rambo discovers that strength is not only the ability to endure violence. Strength can also mean choosing what that ability is used for. He cannot undo the past, but he can decide whether the past remains a prison. That makes the final movement more significant than another victory on a battlefield. He is no longer simply surviving circumstances. He is making a choice about the life he wants after survival. The critical response shows that this strategy was not universally successful. Many reviewers objected to the extreme violence, simplified storytelling, and treatment of the real conflict, while others appreciated the action and Stallone's commitment. Yet the audience response was stronger, and the theatrical result demonstrated commercial viability. This reminds us that artistic reception and market performance measure different things. The strongest filmmaking happens when those systems become invisible. We do not watch a scene and think about the crew moving equipment through a jungle. We do not hear a musical theme and calculate its cost. We simply experience a character making a decision, and that decision feels real because thousands of technical choices have made the emotion believable. The greatest return generated by this film is therefore not measured only by box office. Financially, it demonstrated that the brand remained commercially relevant. Technologically, it demonstrated that practical filmmaking could still create enormous perceived value. Psychologically, it transformed a character who had spent years running from himself. Artistically, It ended with an image in which movement toward home carried more meaning than the violence that came before it. Rambo begins beside the river, separated from the world. He ends by moving toward home, carrying everything that happened with him. The past has not disappeared. The scars have not disappeared. His capacity for violence has not disappeared. What has changed is his relationship with those things. He is no longer defined only by what was done to him or what he was trained to do. He can finally begin deciding what comes next. That is why the film remains useful as a cinematic case study. It combines nostalgia with novelty, practical production with digital finishing, historical reality with fictional drama, and financial discipline with spectacle. It may never receive universal critical admiration, but it demonstrates how an old cinematic identity can be rebuilt for a new commercial environment while retaining its emotional core. In the end, cinema converts capital into emotion. Money is invested, technology is purchased, labor is organized, and marketing buys attention, but what survives is meaning. This film brings those forces together around one wounded character who finally chooses not simply to survive another battle, but to take another step toward living. If you found this deep dive meaningful, my literature-loving friends, consider liking and subscribing so we can keep decoding the business and beauty of cinema together.